Welcome. Good evening. I was just instructed that we should start in time. Of course, there will be a lot of material presented by Adam Szeidl, so we don't take away this precious time here. So this will be the lecture by Adam Szeidl, as you see, The Political Economy of Alternative Realities. And my name is Carsten Schneider, and I welcome you in two roles. One is as Pro-Rector for External Relations. I welcome you on behalf of CU, but also, and this is the point I want to drive home in my 1 minute, also as the one at CU responsible for the CIVICA University Alliance, which consists of CU, Sciences Po, Bocconi, LSE, the Hertie School in Berlin, the UI in Florence, SSE in Stockholm, SNSPA in Bucharest, the IE in Madrid, and the SGH in Warsaw. And the goal of CIVICA, like any other of these European University Alliance, of which there are 50-something by now, is to create the experience of a European university in all its aspects, from teaching to research, administrative exchange, sharing of resources and experiences. And I'm sure some of you in the room have had some contact, but I just want you to have more of it. My specific role in the CIVICA is to foster interest in research cooperation. And in this light, this event here is, I think, a very good case in point. So even though today it's a speaker from CU, before it was from Bocconi and it was from Sciences Po, and I don't know if there are more coming up. So these lecture series show that CIVICA works as a platform for cooperation, not only across the alliances. We invite speakers from other places, but also within universities. So it's me as a political scientist, which I'm also speaking to a crowd that I usually don't address. And I'm also want to point out that I'm particularly happy about the choice of the topics of this lecture series. They all talk about populism and their, consequences, alternative realities. And I see a lot of room for collaboration with people like political scientists who are working on similar topics. And I'm very much looking forward to this. So once again, a warm welcome. And I pass over to Adam Sadakowski, head of department, who introduces the speaker and the topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. It's my honor to introduce today's speaker. I don't know whether I know Adam's CV from beginning to the end, but I just want to give a few highlights. So Adam first studied mathematics. He has a master's in mathematics and then switched to economics. I did physics and then switched to economics. And like myself, he studied at Central European University and then went on to do his PhD at Harvard. Then was faculty member at Berkeley and returned to CU after being associate professor at Berkeley. And now he's a professor of economics here at CU. There's lots of interest, lots of different topics he's been working on, starting from economic theory to development to political economy. So now we'll see a bit of insight on his political economy research. He has won ERC grants, and most importantly, he's a great colleague at the department. So I think I'm really happy to welcome him, and I'm sure you're not here to listen to me. But one little thing that we will have public events in the future as well on political economy. For now, this was the last one, but we are planning another one on inequality next year. And in fact, on Monday, we have a talk about the current financial situation in banks. So you're welcome to come, and please sign up for the email list to get the updates about it. And without further ado, I'll pass over to Adam.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. It is a pleasure to be presenting here. I'm going to talk about the topic of alternative realities. Let me start with what I believe is a striking observation, which is that there are widespread misbeliefs in many countries about fundamental economic, social, and political facts. I've listed a few examples here. So in the US, most Republicans hold, contrary to the consensus of the experts, that climate change is not human-made, that the 2020 election was not free and fair, and this one surprised me, that a majority of Republicans do not reject that the government and the media are controlled by a Satan-worshipping conspiracy. This is QAnon. These misbeliefs are not concentrated to the United States. They exist in other countries as well. Let me give you an example that's closer to home. Most supporters of the Hungarian governing party, Fidesz, hold that there is a plan created and orchestrated by George Soros to bring Muslims to Europe. This is a version of the sort of known conspiracy theory called the white replacement theory that's also popular in the United States. Okay. So what is interesting about these misbeliefs is that they're not sort of about one particular isolated issue. You know, they're not about just climate change, not about just the 2020 election. Rather, they seem to combine into some kind of semi-coherent alternative reality. And this is the topic that I'd like to talk about today. Okay. A first observation is beliefs in these kinds of alternative realities are potentially hugely consequential. You know, people who believe in these alternative realities then vote, make choices that affect climate outcomes, you know, other economic, social, political outcomes. And so understanding why they form these beliefs, what's the impact of their beliefs, and whether there are policies that can be introduced to recover sort of fact-based beliefs. These are first-order important questions. I argue that these are also understudied questions and that they're worthy of study. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about some report on some ongoing academic work that I have with my co-author Ferenc Szűcs that sort of, you know, tries to think about these issues. I should be clear that I'm not going to give you the final answers today. Perhaps maybe a better understanding of some of the issues. That's sort of my goal. So I'd like to talk about three things today. The first is the emergence of these alternative realities. Okay, so how exactly do they arise? What are the circumstances in which they arise? The second topic, and that this is going to be sort of the meat of the presentation today, is what is the specific content of these alternative realities? What is it that I believe is the core narrative that emerges across alternative realities in different countries? And then a final, and sort of the implications of those alternative realities. And then the final thing, and this is the weakest part of my presentation, unfortunately, is what are possible policies to correct beliefs, or how should we think about trying to correct beliefs? So the emergence of alternative realities. So here, a first observation that I like to make is that beliefs in alternative realities seem to be associated with populism. Okay, so my motivating examples on the first slide confirm that. I gave you examples from Republicans in the US, and Republican Party is increasingly a populist party in the US. Also from Fidesz supporters in Hungary. Fidesz is an increasingly populist party in Hungary. But if you look at sort of definitions, commonly used definitions of populism, they do not emphasize these kind of misbeliefs, these beliefs in alternative realities. Okay, so this is an understudied component of populism, and I argue it is potentially a very important component. So this is just sort of positioning this notion of alternative realities in the social science literature. And then when you sort of look at the social science literature and look for sort of explanations for mistaken beliefs, false beliefs, beliefs in conspiracy theories, you know, of course, this is a vast literature. But my definitely less than perfect reading of this literature is that the most common explanations for these kind of misbeliefs focus on what an economist would call the demand side of beliefs. So the way I think about belief formation, or the way economists like to think about belief formation, or many things, is that there's a demand side, which in this case is the side of the individuals who form these beliefs. Okay, what is it that makes these individuals receptive to forming or holding these false beliefs, or sometimes creating these false beliefs? This is in contrast to the supply side, which would be explanations based on some entrepreneurs, politicians, media entrepreneurs providing these semi-coherent alternative theories so that they are available for individuals to choose to believe in them. Okay. And so I argue that common explanations in the social science literature for beliefs in, for example, conspiracy theories focus on the demand side. And there are many explanations, but one that seems particularly plausible and dominant is the explanation of motivated beliefs. Okay, so this is the idea that people choose beliefs to avoid facing some kind of emotional pain. Okay, so there is some unpleasant fact that I'm unwilling to accept, and to avoid facing or accepting that fact, I'm going to form beliefs in which that fact is untrue or that fact is somehow explained away. So that's an extremely plausible explanation. That's certainly a big part of what's going on. But I think it does not directly explain the specific and rather complex narratives that are emerging in these alternative realities. Okay, why is it a Soros plan? Why is it a Satan worshipping conspiracy? These kinds of things do not immediately follow from the demand side explanation. And because of that, and also because of the fact that beliefs in alternative realities are associated with populism, we hypothesize that the supply side of these beliefs is important. And what I'm going to do next is give you some evidence in support of this hypothesis. I'll give you this evidence from two case studies. First case study will be Hungary, the second will be the United States. And what I'm hoping to take away from these case studies is first evidence on the supply side that politicians are or appearing to be supplying these kinds of alternative realities, and a little bit of understanding of the mechanisms, which will be useful when I get into the second part of my talk, which will be on the content of alternative realities. So case study one about Hungary. So I'll start with a quote from Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Orban's political director at a recent media conference in Budapest, at which this political director said, and this is my translation, that whoever rules a country's media rules the country's thinking, and through that the country. Okay. So what this quote is suggestive of is that the political regime thinks that controlling the media, controlling the supply of ideas is important. And this is not just words. Okay, so consistent with the view articulated in this quote, I argue that the government in Hungary controls a large share of what you could only call private media in quotation marks through a form of media capture. Okay. And what I'd like to do in the next few slides is to give you evidence for this claim, evidence for this media capture, both because I think it's genuinely interesting for understanding the workings of these kinds of populist regimes, and also because it will be relevant in the second half of my talk when I talk about the content and implications of alternative realities. So here I'm making the claim that the government controls a big part of private media. But it's not trivial that the government is able to do this in Hungary, that it should be able to do this in Hungary. Hungary is imperfect, but a democracy. It's also an EU country. There are systems of checks and balances that are supposed to protect independent media. Okay. So here's the mechanism. Mechanism is that the government decides to capture a particular media outlet. A connected investor connected to the government purchases that media outlet, pays a fair market or above market price. And then after this happens, they start to get a lot of state advertising, simultaneous to which the content changes in a marked fashion. So these are just claims here, but let me show you some evidence. This is a figure which is about the biggest online news portal in Hungary, which is called Origo. Is a horizontal axis in this figure is time. This is the 2010s. Okay. During the 2010s, Origo was gradually becoming captured by the regime. And this happened through two stages. First, in 2014, there was a change in the editor of Origo. Allegedly, the previous editor was pushed out after covering a government corruption scandal. And then in 2016, there was a change in owner, and the new owner was a relative of the governor of the central bank. Okay, so the portal became directly connected to the government. So what happened during this time and around these changes in ownership with advertising revenues in Origo? This is plotted in the figure. So focus on the red curve, which is a measure of state-owned firms' advertising that is placed on this portal. normalized in some way. Not so important how we normalize. Okay. So when I talk about state-owned firms advertising, this is firms like the National Lottery or utilities companies or transportation companies. What you see is before the change in editor, state-owned firms advertising was normalized in some way, between 20 and 40%. After the editor changed, it increased to something like 40 to 60%. And then when the owner changed, it quickly went up all the way to 80 or 90%. Okay. A lot of increase in state advertising placed on Origo. Now, during the same period, the market share of Origo measured, for example, with the number of visitors, this is the black curve, was, if anything, declining. Okay. So this increase in state-owned firms advertising is not justified by Origo becoming a bigger media outlet. Okay, so it seems like as Origo is becoming more and more closely connected to the government, it is getting more and more state advertising revenue. Does content change at the same time? This figure is the answer to that question. What I'm plotting here is the same time period on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, a measure of corruption coverage in Origo, that's the red curve, as well as a measure of corruption coverage in its main competitor called Index, and the other big online news portal, which was uncaptured during this period. Okay, so independent of the government. So the way we measure this corruption coverage is we identified a bunch of government corruption scandals, and then we just looked at what share of articles are about those corruption scandals during this time. So the curves go up and down because sometimes there are more scandals than other times. But still, there is a clear pattern if you look at this. So in the first period, before the change of editor, when both of these media were uncaptured, you see that the red and the blue are sort of relatively closely tracking each other, and the difference, if you compare, statistically, is not significant. So corruption coverage was the same on these two outlets. Then there's a change of editor in Origo. Okay, so it becomes closer to the government, and now there is a gap. Okay, the red is a little bit below the blue, and statistically, if you compute, this is a significant difference. And then there's a change of ownership, and then suddenly there's a wide gap. Okay, now Origo is covering corruption scandals to a much lower extent than is the uncaptured competitor Index. Okay. So if you look at this figure and the previous figure simultaneously, what you're seeing is Origo is getting more and more state money as it's becoming closer and closer to the government, and at the same time is covering corruption less and less as it's becoming closer and closer to the government. So this kind of pattern we label media capture through favor exchange. Okay. What seems to be going on is politicians are allocating advertising to these connected media such as Origo, and at the same time, Origo is changing its coverage to cater to the politicians' preferences. Okay. So this, the example that I've shown you is just one portal in one market, the online news market. But we estimate that today the government controls about half of the television and over 2/3 of the print, online, and radio markets through methods similar to this. Okay. And our takeaway from these facts is that the government seems to think that the supply of ideas is important. Why else would you want to capture a large part of the private media unless you think that controlling the supply of ideas helps you politically? So this is evidence, this Hungarian case study is evidence that the government thinks the supply of ideas is important. But it is not evidence that people respond to that. Okay. So we know the government is changing the supply of ideas, if you accept what I've told you. But we don't know, I haven't shown you, that this is affecting people's thinking or people's behavior. So my second piece of evidence is going to be on that. And it's not going to be the super convincing evidence, but it's going to be, I think, strongly suggestive evidence that indeed the government's messages are changing people's thinking. And this is coming from the US context. It's a case study that involves Donald Trump. So what we do in this case study is we look at Donald Trump's rallies before the 2016 election. I don't know if you remember this, but the way Trump campaigns, maybe the way most politicians in the US campaign, but certainly the way he campaigns, is he holds these huge rallies where he fills an auditorium much bigger than this with supporters, and then he gives speeches. Okay. And so what we're interested in is whether having a speech by Trump, having a rally by Trump in a US city results in more people in that city searching on Google for Breitbart News. Okay. We're interested in this because Breitbart News, I don't know if you know this, is a leading publisher of conspiracy theories and misleading stories. Okay. So Google searches for Breitbart News is one imperfect measure for whether the campaign of Trump results in increased interest in alternative realities. Okay, increased interest in conspiracy theories, for example. And so what we have done to check this is we looked at all Trump campaign events or in the run-up to the 2016 election, all his rallies. And then we looked at Google searches in the metropolitan areas in which those rallies were taking place of Breitbart News. And then we stacked all these, these events were all taking place at different times. But we stacked them, we normalized the week when they were taking place to week 0 in this figure. And then we averaged across these events, basically, searches for Breitbart News. This is what an economist would call an event study. Okay? But really what this event study is telling you is what's the dynamics of searching for Breitbart News on Google before versus after a Trump rally taking place in your metropolitan area. Okay? And you see that before, so horizontal axis is weeks before the week of the Trump rally. Week 0 is the week when the rally takes place in your city, let's say Atlanta. And you see that weeks before the Trump rally, Breitbart searches are kind of flat. Okay, there's no variation over time. They are not statistically different from 0, which is some benchmark. It's not important what exactly it is. But then after the week of the Trump rally, there's a significant increase. And it's, the blue shade here is the confidence interval. So the fact that it does not contain 0 means that this is a significant increase. And a significant increase lasts for about a month, about 4 weeks. Okay. So in response to Trump giving a campaign rally in Atlanta, Google searches about Breitbart News in Atlanta significantly increased for a month. So this is evidence that Trump rallies generate active interest in conspiracy theories, or active interest that generates access to conspiracy theories by the people in that city. So my takeaway from these 2 case studies, that's my interpretation of the evidence so far, is that the evidence suggests that the supply of misinformation, political supply of misinformation, may be important. But what I haven't talked about, and this I think is maybe the more important, maybe the more important part of today's presentation, is what exactly is the misinformation that's being provided here, and what is the impact of the kind of misinformation that's being provided. Okay, so, to make this more concrete, what content do politicians and friendly media communicate to the audiences? And so immediately you can think about 2 kinds of content that they communicate. The first kind of content, this is sort of the standard reaction. Certainly the first reaction that I had when I started thinking about this question is they provide positive propaganda. Okay, so the example on Origo, and Origo was not reporting corruption scandals, is an example of this. Okay, they're suppressing corruption scandals, effectively painting the government in a more positive light than their competitors. But I claim, and I'll show you evidence for this, that there is another kind of content that these media also provide, which is more important in my opinion, but it's certainly important, which is these alternative realities that I started on the first slide with. And this is a key slide. Having read some of the content of these media in different countries, our assessment is that the following is a key alternative reality, a key false narrative, if you like, that we observe emerging in different countries, slightly different variations, but this is sort of the core idea across different countries. So I argue the key alternative reality is this. This is false. Okay. This alternative reality says that the intellectual elite, okay, so who is the intellectual elite? Intellectual elite is scientists, journalists, people like us. So the intellectual elite conspires. We sit down in a room together, we have a conversation, smoke cigars, have some whiskey. Conspires to criticize a regime's corruption or regime's incompetence, not because the regime is corrupt, not because the regime is incompetent, but because the elite disagrees with the regime, disagrees with the politician about some fundamental cultural values. Okay. I claim this is the key alternative reality that you observe in different countries. Let me make this a little more precise. Okay, so in the Hungarian context, there are many versions of this, but one version in the Hungarian context that you see is that Brussels, which this is the stand-in for the intellectual elite in this special case, criticizes Orban, the prime minister's corruption or the country's corruption, not because Orban is corrupt, but because Orban is anti-immigration. Okay. So if you're if you believe in this alternative reality, you hear that Brussels says, there are all kinds of improper, how to make that a noun? All kinds of corruption activities associated with EU funds. Your response is going to be, well, those are lies. They're only saying this because Orban does not like immigrants and Brussels wants to import immigrants into the country. Okay, so that's the alternative reality in the Hungarian context. A version of this in the American context would be CNN is criticizing Trump's competence, not because Trump is actually incompetent, but because Trump is anti-woke, whereas the CNN is pro-woke. And so CNN wants the wokeness ideology to succeed so much that they want to get rid of Trump, who is protecting the country against the wokeness ideology. Okay. So that would be the content of the alternative reality that I am emphasizing here in the US context. Now, if the voters believe this alternative reality, then the direct implication is that the voters are going to distrust the criticism of the elite. If the voters think, well, Brussels is only criticizing Orban because of the anti-corruption, anti-immigration issue, voter is not going to think that Brussels criticism has content, or is going to trust less the criticism of Brussels than he otherwise would. That's the reason I argue that the politicians are supplying this kind of alternative reality, because it discredits the criticism of the elite. As long as you have an intellectual elite, you worry about the criticism of the intellectual elite, you want to discredit it, this is a way to do so. Okay, so discrediting is the core idea. So let me tell you a story now. A few weeks ago, I was asked to give a talk to an Israeli audience about, basically this topic. I don't know if you know, but Israel is sort of on the verge of going down this populist path that Hungary has gone down on, some other countries have gone down. And so I didn't know much about the Israeli situation at the time, but I wanted to predict, based on these ideas up to this bullet point, I wanted to predict what would be the alternative reality, what would be content of propaganda in the Israeli context. And my prediction was this, that the judiciary in Israel criticizes Netanyahu's corruption, not because Netanyahu is actually corrupt, but because they disagree on the Arab-Israeli situation. Because Netanyahu is anti-Palestine and the judiciary is pro-Palestine. Okay. And then I checked, and that is definitely part of the narrative in Israel. Okay. So guess what I'm trying to say? This is not scientific evidence, of course, but what I'm trying to say is that this is a narrative that you see occur in a number of different countries, and in a sense, it has predictive power. Okay, so I was able to predict, maybe imperfectly, the Israeli narrative based on having seen the narrative in some other countries. So what I want to do next is two things. First, I want to give you evidence. So here, I'm just claiming this, but I want to give you evidence that indeed, this kind of alternative reality is the central component of the communication of politicians, at least in the Hungarian context. I'll give you evidence for Hungary. That will be the first thing I want to do. And then the second thing I want to do is walk you through some implications of this kind of alternative reality, beliefs in this kind of alternative reality. So first, evidence from the Hungarian context. So this is about the same online news portal, Origo, that I introduced a few slides earlier. Okay? And this is a figure about the content that's provided on Origo. And I want to use this figure to argue that the alternative reality, this discrediting logic in a migration context, is indeed the product of political supply. Okay. So what I'm plotting here is articles on Origo, that's the red, also on index, that's the blue, that are about migration. The share of those articles that also mention Brussels or Soros. Okay. So I should have said earlier in the previous slide that, when Brussels criticizes, always George Soros is in the background in this alternative reality. Okay. So there's no reason to mention migration stories with Brussels or Soros because, they're not closely related. Migration is about people coming into Europe. There's no I cannot think of a very sound reason to mention Brussels and Soros with migration stories. And indeed, around the time of the migration crisis, 2015 or 2016, the number of such conventions was very low. Okay. Number of such conventions was also low and similar across Origo and Index after 2016 when Origo was captured. Okay, so the gray area is when Origo was captured by the government. But then suddenly in 2017, just before the 2018 elections, okay, these conventions shoot up on Origo and not so much on Index. So now they suddenly start to link the migration crisis with Brussels and with Soros, consistent with the alternative reality that I highlighted. So the fact that this is happening not when the migration crisis is happening, instead it's happening right before the 2018 elections, is consistent with this being a political product that is supplied for political gain. Let me show you a second figure, which is a similar figure, but in the corruption and human rights context. Okay. So there are NGOs in Hungary that, criticize the government, not just the government, but also the government about corruption or human rights violations. Okay, so these NGOs are Transparency International, Amnesty, Helsinki, and TASS. Okay. I should emphasize that these are not Soros NGOs. Okay, they get some money from OSF, but it's a small part of their budget. They're not open society foundations or or CU, for that matter. And what I'm plotting here is the share of articles about these NGOs that also mention Soros, okay, that bring in this conspiracy element that the elite is conspiring to discredit, conspiring to criticize. And you see that these conventions, the share of these conventions is extremely low until 2017, when exactly at the same time as we observed the increase in the previous figure, suddenly they increased sharply on Origo, not on Index. Okay. So again, this is evidence that what we are observing is a political product that was created right before the 2018 elections, and is a political product which is linking these organizations criticizing corruption with the conspiracy theory that I highlighted earlier. Okay. So my argument so far is that political supply is important, and a big part of supply is supplying this kind of alternative reality. And just to recap, the alternative reality is the elite is criticizing not because there is actual incompetence or corruption, but because of disagreement on cultural issues. Immigration primarily in Hungary. So what are the implications of this alternative reality? Okay. So the number one implication, and this is the fundamental reason I think the politicians are spreading these alternative realities, is that once the intellectual elite is discredited, political accountability is reduced. If you think the elite is conspiring, you're not going to trust when the elite is criticizing the prime minister. And so it will be easier for the prime minister to stay in power. Consistent with this prediction, what you see here in a cross-section of countries in the European Union is on the horizontal axis, the populist vote share. So the share of the populist parties in that country. Hungary is here. And on the vertical axis, the share of citizens that trust in the media. Okay. And a higher populist vote share is associated with a lower share of citizens that trust in the media. So this is, I'm not claiming that this is purely and only because of the story that I'm telling, but it's certainly consistent with the story that I'm telling. A high populist vote share, my story says, should be associated with a greater supply of alternative realities, more people believing in those alternative realities, and therefore distrusting the intellectual elite, distrusting the media. So it's broadly consistent with the interpretation that I'm offering. Implication 2. Once the voters distrust the intellectual elite, not only do they distrust the media, they're also going to distrust scientists. And not only do they distrust them in the political domain, they're also going to distrust them in other domains. Once you think that conspiracies by the intellectual elite are possible, you're going to be very careful when the intellectual elite makes you recommendations. And this is very costly potentially because it worsens choices, for example, in the climate or the COVID context. So let me give you evidence that's consistent with this prediction. So here, what I'm showing you is voters' trust in science. Okay, now it's not trust in the media, now it's trust in science. This is from the US, and the blue bars always represent Democrats, and the red bars represent Republicans. The horizontal axis is time. This is 3 snapshots in 1998, 2008, 2018. And what you see is that as the Republican Party is increasingly becoming a populist party, increasingly supplying alternative realities, that would be the argument that I'm advocating here, Republicans' trust in science is gradually declining, whereas Democrats' trust in science kind of stays flat. And this matters because whether you trust scientists' recommendations is going to affect, for example, the choices in the health domain that you're making. And what I'm plotting here is exactly evidence on those choices in the COVID context. Okay. This is in a cross-section of US counties, American counties. And what I'm measuring on the horizontal axis is the vote share of Republicans in that county in a recent election. What I'm measuring on the vertical axis in the figure on the left is the share of people in the county which are fully vaccinated. And it's striking. Higher Republican vote share, lower share fully vaccinated. That's the figure on the left. Figure on the right, same horizontal axis. Vertical axis is the share who believe in climate change. Striking. So the narrative, again, the narrative I'm telling you is politicians want to stay in power, so they supply this alternative reality. Alternative reality succeeds in discrediting the intellectual elite, okay? Discrediting the media, so there's gonna be less trust in the media. Also discrediting scientists, so there's gonna be less trust in science. Because there is less trust in science, you're gonna make worse choices, or voters are gonna make worse choices in the health domain, okay? It's hugely consequential. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. I can talk about this afterwards if you're interested. Implication 4. This, I think, is maybe the most important and is also a subtle implication. So once you have people who believe in the alternative reality, I argue that's going to result in politicians setting bad policies, harmful policies, even though they know. Suppose you're a politician and you know this is a policy that's going to kill people, that is a policy that's universally harmful. You're going to have an incentive to set that policy because what that policy does is it triggers the criticism of the intellectual elite. And you want that criticism. Once you have discredited the intellectual elite, you do not want the intellectual elite to praise you. Okay? Once you have tilted the beliefs in the voter's mind that the intellectual elite is a bunch of evil conspirators, you do not want them to be on your side. You want them to be against you. If they are on your side, the voter might think, wait a minute, now the coherent alternative reality starts to not make sense. Are you maybe also part of the conspiracy, or were you just telling me lies? Okay. You as a politician want to avoid that. You don't want to puncture the alternative reality. And so what you want is the elite to criticize you. How can you make the elite criticize you? By making bad choices. Okay. By setting policy that is harmful, the elite is going to say, oh, that's not a good thing to do. And that's a badge of honor for your voters. Okay. If you're a Republican and the New York Times is criticizing you, you might think that's the logic here, that's going to increase your support from Republican voters. I think this is a surprising implication. It's a sobering implication. And I think it's potentially a very important implication. Okay. Once the elite is discredited, you want them to criticize you. And so you make bad policy. So here's some evidence on this. Again, in the COVID context. So this is in a cross-section of US states. Blue is Democrats, red is Republicans as before. And in the left panel, so these two bars, what I'm plotting is the share of governors that set a policy of inside mask mandates. Okay. And you see that there's a higher share of Republican governors that set an inside mask mandate policy, a lower share of Republican governors. At this point in time, mask mandates was the scientific consensus. Okay. So Republicans were violating the scientific consensus with a higher probability than Democrats, which is precisely the prediction that I articulated on previous slide, if these Republicans are indeed spreading alternative realities. Okay. And I should say that here we made these this cross-state comparison as comparable as possible. So there are any differences, for example, in the intensity of of COVID across these states are netted out. Okay, so here we're controlling for a bunch of observables. Figure on the right is similar, but here what we are plotting is the share of governors that publicly vaccinate. Okay, so when you're a governor, you go get your shot against COVID. Is that on television or not? That's what's being measured on the vertical axis. If it's on television, presumably voters are going to think, well, the governor is sending the message that vaccination is a good thing, so I should vaccinate as well. And here too, you see Republican governors are doing that with a lower probability than our Democrat governors. So consistent with this prediction that once you spread alternative realities, you're going to set bad policies. The final implication that I wanted to talk about is this. This again, I think is quite important. Imagine that the elite has been discredited. So, the traditional news media has been discredited. And you are a citizen. You still have a demand for news. You want to find out how the world works, what happened this week, what happened today in the world. So you want to consume news. But you no longer trust CNN. You no longer trust the New York Times because they are conspirators. So what happens is that space has been created for new media entrepreneurs and maybe new political entrepreneurs to enter the media market. Okay, CNN and the New York Times are not trustworthy anymore. I still want to read the news. Somebody else is going to step in and provide that news. And I claim that somebody is or can be Breitbart or Fox News or the One America Network, and you can think about other examples. Now imagine that you are Fox News, okay? And you are taking advantage of the space that has been created in the media market because the traditional media is no longer trusted. What message do you want to send about the alternative reality? Well, recall, the reason demand for your product is high is that people believe in the alternative reality. The one thing you do not want to do is puncture that belief in the alternative reality. Instead, what you do want to do is reinforce beliefs in the alternative reality because that's the reason that people are consuming your product, or that's the reason people are consuming your product at such high intensity. Okay. So these new media entrepreneurs have a strong incentive to reinforce the alternative reality to maintain the demand for their product. Okay. And I think this is the logic that explains why Fox News, the One America Network, and so on, were spreading, this huge election lies, for example, after the 2020 elections, and are continuously spreading conspiracy theories and other aspects of these alternative realities, because this is the way that you maintain your audience. Okay. If you tell them, look, all of that is false, either the audience is going to think you're also part of the conspiracy, or the audience is going to think, well, then maybe the alternative reality is false. I can go back to watching CNN. Neither of those outcomes is good for you. So final bit is how to correct beliefs. And this is, as I advertised, the weakest part, unfortunately, of my presentation. And so here I just have 3 ideas. But I guess what I want to say first and foremost is this is a very important topic for research. Okay? It's an understudied topic for research, very important topic for research. I encourage all of you to work on this. So my idea number 1 is protect independent media. Okay. Just the fact that in Hungary, the regime has gone through so much effort to capture independent media suggests that protecting independent media has a role. And in countries, so again, let's think about the Israeli case. Hungary in the 2010s, maybe Hungary did not have a sufficiently strong civil society, or maybe the Hungarian civil society was unprepared. In any case, Hungary did not succeed in protecting independent media. But Israel may have a stronger civil society, may be more prepared because they have seen the experience of other countries. So maybe they are in a better position to protect independent media. And then other countries who might be facing this kind of populist alternative realities may be in a better position to do this. The second point is reduce the cultural division between the elite and the voters. So think about the logic of the alternative reality that I'm advertising here. Not advertising, that I'm not discussing here. Advertising was a bad word. Logic of the alternative reality is that the reason newspapers are criticizing me is because they disagree on a cultural issue. Okay, because I'm woke and because I'm anti-woke and they're woke, or because I'm anti-immigration and they're pro-immigration. If that disagreement is smaller, this alternative reality is going to be less convincing. Okay, if they're criticizing me, let's think about as an example, U.S. during the Cold War. I argue that there was a fundamental issue, which is the threat of the Soviet Union, that united the elite, intellectual elite, and the voters. And so an alternative reality that says, the elite is criticizing me because we disagree about the Soviet Union, that would not have worked because everybody understood that there is broad agreement about the risk of the threat of the Soviet Union. That's just one possible interpretation of why there was less populism during the Cold War period than there is now in the United States. Okay, and it's not necessarily the true interpretation, but I guess what I'm trying to highlight here is if there are other issues on which there is agreement between the elite and the voters, making those other issues more salient is a possible way to limit the harm of alternative realities. And so I personally thought that the Ukraine war would be such an issue in the United States because it seemed like there is broad agreement across society, including Republican politicians, that Russia is a geopolitical threat, and and that has to be resisted. I was wrong. Yeah, but that's the sort of thing that I have in mind here. Okay, so reducing this kind of division, or making unifying issues more salient, is a possible way to deal with this problem. And then the final thing is that we could try to focus on narrower issues where agreement can be found. So suppose that you're talking to a believer in the alternative reality. It's going to be impossible, I predict, to convince that person that the alternative reality is all wrong. But it may be easier to convince that person about one particular issue which is sufficiently removed from the broader worldview. So let me make an example. If I'm talking with a Trump supporter, I don't think I'll convince him that Trump is incompetent or corrupt. Maybe I won't convince him that climate change is man-made, but maybe I can convince him that recycling is a good thing. Okay. Because that's sufficiently removed from the loaded political things that we can have reasonable arguments about the benefits of recycling. And if you're able to do this, sort of focus on narrow issues and reach agreements, that maybe that also helps because it's a first step towards building more trust. So these are my ideas about how to change beliefs, and I can only repeat myself. This is the weakest part of the presentation. Please work more on this. So in summary, I have argued that alternative realities are a key feature of populism, key aspect of populism. That politicians supply these alternative realities to discredit criticism coming from the intellectual elite. That the supply of these alternative realities is harmful not only because it reduces political accountability, although it does do that, but also because beliefs in the alternative realities worsen outcomes in other non-political domains. Public policy, media landscape, those were some examples. And correcting beliefs is a first very important topic on which more research is needed. That's all I had.